Well, if, like me, you're an avid consumer of political podcasts, you will know the name Rory Stewart. Together with Alastair Campbell, he presents the Rest is Politics podcast from the UK, which roams across British, American and global politics with genuine insight. Rory Stewart has emerged as a leading podcaster after nearly a decade in Parliament as a Tory MP and Minister who unsuccessfully challenged Boris Johnson for the leadership and Prime Ministership some years ago. He's also an academic and former diplomat who served in Indonesia, Montenegro and Iraq. He also spent a couple of years walking across Iran, Pakistan and Afghanistan. He's an author, a documentary maker, an all-round fascinating person who I'm excited to say is here with me in the studio. I'm David Speers on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Rory Stewart, great to talk to you while you're here in Australia. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Given we're a couple of weeks away from a pretty important election, I thought we'd start in the United States.
Sure.
I don't know at this point whether it's worth making predictions, given how tight the polls are, but for what it's worth, you are still confident that Kamala Harris will get there?
I believe Kamala Harris will win. I think the polling companies have got frightened because they miscalled the previous elections. So they're all saying it's 50-50, and they're all hovering in the centre because they don't want to stick their necks out and get it wrong again. I think their theories on how Trump will win don't make sense to me. They're presuming that young African-American voters, men who didn't vote in 16, 20 and 22 are going to turn out and vote for Trump, and I don't think they will.
You think they'll stay home? Because it seems the excitement is not there amongst those young black American voters for Kamala Harris.
Or they may express support for Trump, but it's very different from actually turning out to vote.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So she'll get there in the states that count, get the electoral college
what I
vote.
believe. I mean, obviously it's a foolish thing to get into the game of predicting when all the polls are saying it's 50-50. But no, I think she'll win and she may win comfortably.
We'll see in a couple of weeks. What is at stake for the world, and in particular for US allies, strong allies like the UK, like Australia? What's at stake in this election?
Well, if Donald Trump wins, it's firstly a body blow for the US Constitution. I mean, this is a convicted felon who backed an insurrection against the Capitol. He is a man of terrible moral behavior with extremely questionable links to Russia. I mean, if you were trying to define the kind of definitional worst candidate, that's before you get onto his racism, his misogyny, his anti-immigration. So America really matters, obviously, to the world. It's the world's largest economy. It's the world's most successful and prosperous democracy. If that begins to rot with a figure like Trump being re-elected, the world's in real trouble. And I think that then leads on to other things. That leads on to Russia, Ukraine. That leads on to China, Taiwan. That leads on to NATO and much more.
Well, I mean, we can't go through all of them. What does it mean? We're very focused on China, Taiwan. The China-US relationship really defines our future. What does it mean for that, do you think?
I think Donald Trump is an isolationist. I think he's made it very clear that he puts America first, that he believes in strong men, that he doesn't have much sympathy for democracy, and that he thinks America should largely stay out of it and allow strong men to do what they want.
So let Xi Jinping do what he wants with Taiwan.
I would say that if Xi Jinping were to do something in Taiwan, it's very difficult to predict, of course, because Trump is an unpredictable person and his vanity comes into play. But it seems to me extremely unlikely that he would be sending a US aircraft carrier into harm's way in order to protect Taiwan.
And Kamala Harris, is that a continuation of the Biden approach on foreign policy?
I think her instincts, Kamala Harris's instincts, are slightly more soft left than Biden's, and she's from a very different generation. I mean, remember Biden entered the Senate in the 1970s. When he looks at Israel-Palestine, he was somebody who knew Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister of the 70s. I mean, he really is a kind of, he reaches back into a very distant world. But although her instincts may be more progressive, more left-wing on foreign policy, possibly a bit closer to President Obama's, the reality is she doesn't have much foreign policy experience. She was a domestic prosecutor, a bit like Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom. And therefore, she seems to be very dependent on Biden's foreign policy team. So there's a strong likelihood that the key people there, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Samantha Power, will continue in her team.
For all the faults that you lay out about Donald Trump, why is there the appeal? What do you put that down to?
Well, I think the first answer is a really boring answer, which is that a lot of people always vote Republican, and it doesn't really matter who's on the ticket. And that's probably 90% of his vote. So the interesting thing, I guess, is the sort of 10% of people. One interesting group are the Republicans who can't bear to vote for Trump, and they're almost more comprehensible, although it's sad that there are so few of them. But there's also a sense that I'm here quoting a colleague of mine from Yale University called Tim Snyder, who says, and I think he's right, and it's Michael Lewis says this too, the fantastic writer of Moneyball, that Trump genuinely is an angry man. And it's difficult to understand why, but people resonate with his anger. You know, what's he angry about? He's angry that he was a second-tier property developer in New York. He was angry that his dad wasn't nicer to him. He was angry that that he lost the 2020 election.
Does that work for him? Isn't there anger there too amongst those who feel politics hasn't worked for them, that globalisation hasn't worked for them, and they see an angry man in Donald Trump, and that's the appeal.
Exactly. And yet there's so much that hasn't worked for people. And I think the most dramatic thing is that the incomes of everyday people have stagnated terribly. So roughly speaking, from the Second World War to the 1970s in the US, every year, GDP per capita went up by 3.5%. Since 2006, it's gone up by 0.7% a year. Median income's basically frozen, while the very rich have got richer and richer and richer. And people feel this. They feel that, you know, their daughters are working in Walmart, earning $15 an hour, which is what they were earning working in Detroit in the late 1970s.
So Trump comes along and says, I'm going to fix this, bring jobs back through more protectionism. He's going to, you know, increase tariffs on the world. This could spark a global trade war, couldn't it?
Yeah. Protectionism is very bad for the world.
And it's increasing.
It's increasing.
Not just Trump.
No, it's a big phenomenon. I mean, I'm on a tour around. I'm speaking not just in Melbourne, but I'm speaking in Canberra and Perth and Brisbane and Sydney. And one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is what's happened to global trade. I mean, the very strange thing is that until recently, global trade was growing about twice as quickly as normal economic growth. It's halved. And this is America putting up barriers. The European Union hasn't particularly dropped barriers, but all over the world, we're moving away from the world of the 90s where we were trying to make trade easier into a world where we're trying to make trade more difficult.
We're also moving into a world where blocks are forming once again. And I want to get your thoughts on AUKUS, because this is a newish block that is all about right now nuclear-powered submarines, but then so much more, the US, the UK and Australia. Does that survive under a Trump administration?
It's a very good question. I think it will survive if he thinks that it's in America's economic interest for it to survive. But I don't think he's particularly interested in grand geostrategic partnerships. I mean, remember, essentially, NATO, whose cornerstone has been the US since the Second World War, he's essentially turning around and saying he's not interested. He barely understands what NATO's there for. Doesn't understand this thing called Article 5, which is about defending other NATO states.
Boris Johnson, there's a story in the paper here this morning about a new book that he's written suggesting that AUKUS could be extended to include France at some point.
Well, as somebody who ran to be Prime Minister against Boris Johnson, the extraordinary thing about Boris is his ability to just make up complete nonsense day by day.
Is that one just nonsense?
I think he would have just rolled out of bed and thought, why not? Why not get France in? Wouldn't that be splendid? Without remotely thinking about why France isn't in there and what on earth France would be doing in it.
Doesn't make any sense to you.
No, it doesn't make any sense to me. No.
Before we leave the US, do you think there is any impact on politics in countries like Australia and the UK from the whole Trump phenomenon, which we've been witnessing now for, it feels like, a decade or more? The coarseness, the way facts can be ignored. Does this permeate political culture in the Anglosphere?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing that's going on that I notice as a working politician is what in Britain and maybe in Australia we call the dead cat strategy, which is to say, in fact, I think in fact it was introduced by an Australian, Linton Crosby, into the British political discourse, which is if somebody's focusing on some scandal, something that you've got wrong, you just slap a dead cat on the table and they move on. So
suddenly we're all talking about the dead cat.
Suddenly we're talking about dead cats. So you can see Trump does this again and again, and it's incredibly dramatic. So there is a significant, serious allegation by one of the most senior members of Trump's administration that Trump is being blackmailed by Vladimir Putin. Right? That's a pretty big deal.
And well, are you talking about the one that's been around from the get-go?
Yeah. But it's more and more information that's been coming out in the last 2-3 weeks, right? As that's running, suddenly he says people are eating cats and dogs, right? So the story moves on to the immigrants are eating cats and dogs. Then as soon as we're on the immigrants are eating cats and dogs, some other weird monstrosity will be flopped on the table. And the whole thing will go from a massive, serious story about national security and relations with Russia into a new story every day. I mean, today it'll be he'll say something grotesque while working on a fat fryer in McDonald's in Pennsylvania, and we'll be on to that too. And it's this ability to trivialize everything. If you can generate a new dramatic story 2 or 3 times in a 24-hour news cycle, which Trump is a genius at, you can't even remember. I mean, Boris Johnson did this in a smaller way. I mean, literally by the end, you couldn't remember what scandals he'd done. You know, he was taking donations for his wallpaper. He was partying during COVID. He was lying to Parliament. He was proroguing Parliament. He was lying to the Queen. But you just couldn't keep your head around it all because there was a new thing happening all the time.
Is it an effective strategy in today's social media and media cycle?
Yeah, it works very well because, of course, the journalists are looking for something to report, and bang, there's a headline. You know, and what's interesting about the populists is that they're able to move the story on often by lying or saying something daft. I mean, famously, Boris Johnson partly won the Brexit campaign by putting a big lie on the side of a bus, saying that, you know, we were going to save £350 million a day if we left the European Union, and it seems that he and his campaign knew that it was false and did it deliberately because they thought, well, the journalists can then waste a few days talking about the lie and move the story on.
Let me take you to the Australian political scene. What impact, if any, does Anthony Albanese have on the global stage? How is he described or known? Or what would spring to mind if I said, who is Anthony Albanese?
I think Australia at the moment, over the last 20 years, is increasingly seen as quite a stable, grown-up, moderate force in international democratic politics, partly because you have bucked the trend in terms of economic growth. The basic story that the world has been through since about 2003, 2004 is that the liberal democracies over the last 20 years lost confidence. Democracy ceased to deliver. People became increasingly angry in the US, in Canada, and across Europe.
And you see polls showing support for democracy slipping, particularly amongst young people.
Catastrophic. And I mean, let's look at Germany, where the AfD, which is a genuine neo-Nazi party, has just won in Thuringia, comes second in Saxony, which crazy far-left pro-Putin party is now very, very dominant in many of the provincial elections, in which Marine Le Pen is likely to become the next president of France, etc., etc. So in that context, people look a little enviously at Australia and try to work out what the deal is here. And I think
we're seen as an island of successful democracy.
Yeah, which is interesting because that wasn't always the case. I think you know, when I was young, people thought Australian politics was quite rough and quite wild. We now tend to think of it as being actually much more thoughtful and moderate than the politics of the rest of the world.
And is that how Anthony Albanese is seen, thoughtful and moderate?
He's seen certainly by the British left as, or was seen as, an interesting example of a possibility that really matters to Keir Starmer, which is to say that you aren't going to raise taxes in an election and then raise the taxes after the election. So people are very excited by that because that's what the Labour Party is hoping to do in Britain. But I think we're also, you know, again, this is about British perspectives, but I think there is a sense that politicians can be a bit daft. The idea of buying luxury mansions doesn't look great when you're a left-wing leader any more than it...
You thought that was a mistake? How would that go down in the UK?
Well, I mean, look at Keir Starmer's popularity ratings are tanking because he's getting wealthy donors to buy him fancy spectacles and clothes for his wife. I mean, generally, and Boris Johnson was not helped by having, putting up £100,000 wallpaper on his walls. David Cameron understood this and deliberately cut his salary when he came in as Prime Minister, travelled on EasyJet, and he came from a privileged background, but deliberately took it down as Prime Minister.
Fair to say voters don't like to see their Prime Ministers getting anything. Probably don't want them being paid.
No, that's true. And of course, as a working politician, I, often was resentful of that. I remember there were times when I felt like saying to voters, listen, it'd be better if we returned, if you like, to the British Parliament of the early 20th century where MPs didn't receive salaries. And we'll just work for free for you. Fine. Right. But of course there are problems with doing that too.
Yeah, I did hear you on your podcast talk about how you said no to study trips and, I mean, most MPs agree to those, but you took a pretty firm line of...
I think it's terrible, those trips. I think anybody, British, Australian, members of Parliament who get paid by another country to go and visit that country, it's a big mistake. Look, if you travel from the UK on a conservative Friends of Israel trip to Israel or a conservative Middle East Association trip to the Middle East, right? And one of those is pro-Israeli and the other is broadly pro-Palestinian. You are given a very, very partial vision of the world. And my colleagues will come back. These are people who've often spent most of their lives in the UK. They don't have a very sophisticated idea of the outside world. And they come back and they do a 4-day trip in which they're told by the Azerbaijani government or the Israeli government everything that they want to tell them, and come back saying, this is absolutely perfect human rights respecting liberal democracy. I can't see what everyone's complaining about.
That's a problem. Peter Dutton, do you have any impression of the Liberal leader here? He's from the more conservative wing of the Liberal Party in Australia. You're smiling. What's your impression of Peter Dutton?
Well, he seems to clearly be learning about one skill in modern politics, which is making bold, radical, clear statements without a great deal of supporting detail. And again, the skill, if you're dealing with that, is the sort of jiu-jitsu in it, is to work out how you get the detail out of them.
The big example of that is nuclear power, right? He's promised nuclear power in Australia, but we're yet to see the detail. We're told it's coming. But is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think, but it's a general technique, which is to sound bold, decisive, clear.
Strong.
Yeah. And then the challenge, particularly for a ruling government, which of course is mired in detail, is how do you communicate to the public, it's more difficult than that, it's more complex than that, without sounding like you've given up.
You've taken an interest too, I know, in the Teal movement here, as it's called, backed independence, community-based independence, backed by an organisation called Climate 200 with fundraising and so on. Do you see this as an aberration, given politics is what it is at the moment, or a more permanent feature emerging in politics?
I think it's hugely exciting, and I think there's a great demand for it, but it's only in Australia that it's really breaking through. I mean, so much of what Twitter and Facebook has done has been to drive people to the extremes away from the centre ground. It's created a graph of public opinion, which is a kind of U-shape. In other words, very few votes in the centre and a lot of votes on the two extremes. The Teal independence suggests that it is possible to occupy that very difficult ground of being socially liberal, fiscally conservative, and that there's huge demand for it. People are fed up with the kind of nonsense generated by the big parties. But you have to demonstrate that it can be done. I mean, we can see little shoots in Britain. The Greens are beginning to get a few votes. The Lib Dems didn't get a large percentage of the vote, but they got a lot of seats in the last election. But capitalising on that, and I think I'm meeting with some of the Teal independents when I'm here, also thinking about how you move from the local to the national. How do you go from being a great local community representative to having a platform that can appeal nationally is difficult.
And how do you get power to do things nationally because, yes, having a presence in Parliament is powerful. They can decide on legislation, but they're not going to hold a ministry, until
But it can, of course, be done. I mean, Macron did it in France. So if you have a really exceptional politician in the centre, you only need a little foothold in Parliament, and you can do incredible things.
Did you find it frustrating being, when you were an MP, a member of a major party? Would you have preferred to have the freedom of an independent?
I'd much prefer. I'd be a Teal independent any day. Yeah.
One of the issues we're grappling with in Australia, one of the social issues, is what to do about social media. And I know you've taken a bit of an interest in what's coming out of Australia on this. Look, there are a few fronts here. There's the idea of banning kids from social media. There's trying to tackle the misinformation, the disinformation, the spread of hate speech, all of these things. Are governments, do you think, struggling to keep up with regulating how social media is changing our lives?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's not an easy issue because, of course, young people both like and don't like social media. I mean, it would be a much easier if it was just a simple case of them disliking it. I mean, it is for many young people a welcome break from the stress of school. It's a welcome opportunity to socialise with friends.
And that social connection for some can only really happen often on social media.
Yeah, and I mean, we as adults are guilty of it too. We use social media a lot, benefit from it a lot. So the question is, how do you manage the risk? How do you manage the risk of young people being exploited? How do you run the risk of young people being bullied? How do you run the risk of them being basically treated as a commodity and sold stuff? And then their effects on mental health. And so I'm very excited by what Peter Malinowskis is doing. I think the world can learn from Australia. Just the national government has learned from what the South Australian government did. I think the world can look at this. We may not end up in exactly the same place. I think there may be a slightly more moderate version of this. But I think what Peter has done is very exciting because he's shown that you can challenge the social media companies. And by taking such a radical stance, it actually gives opportunities for the rest of us in Europe to say, okay, we're not going to go quite as far as him, but
yeah, because taking on these tech giants isn't easy. But there's political opportunity clearly too.
Yeah,
politicians to show we're listening to parents' concerns. We want to do something about it. I want to turn to the Middle East. This is a hugely divisive issue here in Australia between our two major parties. Peter Dutton, we were talking about the coalition here, very pro-Israel, reluctant to suggest there should be a ceasefire at the moment. The Albanese government is very supportive of the Biden administration's position when it comes to ceasefire and so on. Is it as divisive in the UK between the major parties?
It's profoundly divisive in British politics, but not between the parties.
Right.
The parties all hover around the Biden position, which is not really a position. It's a cop-out. I mean, the Biden position is a nonsense. The Biden position involves saying we believe in a ceasefire, but we're not going to do anything to make a ceasefire happen. We're going to gently sort of wag our finger from the other end of the world. And it's refusing to take a position on international law. I mean, the fundamental problem in the Middle East, from my point of view, is that there was a horrendous terrorist event in October last year in which thousands of innocent people were killed, or over 1,000 innocent people were killed. And responding to terrorism is unbelievably important for the security of the Israeli people. But it's not a blank check, by which I mean you don't get to do anything to combat terrorism. International law exists to make sure that your response is proportionate, that you take proper care in relation to civilians. And in addition to international law, there's the fact of peace, which is that we have to work to create a dignified, independent, viable state for the Palestinians. And the Netanyahu government is not doing that. What they are doing is they are stoking the trauma of October the 7th. They are relying on religious nationalist allies in their government, and they are leaving no space for Palestinian statehood, no space for reconstruction of Gaza, and at the moment are broadening the war into other areas. And this is unbelievably dangerous, not just for the Middle East, but for the whole world, because Israel is a liberal democracy closely tied to the United States. If it acts in a way that it's acting at the moment, it's just declared the Secretary General of the United Nations persona non grata. It's a body blow to the entire international system.
But do you accept Israel's argument that October 7, I mean, we know what happened on October 7. It's something that Hamas and others have pledged to repeat. The hostages are still being held. Hezbollah, for its part, has been lobbing rockets into northern Israel for the past year. Can you see that it wants to be able to defend its citizens?
Yes, I can see that Israel wants to defend its citizens. I can also see that it was the most horrifyingly traumatic event for Israelis, and that it brought profound traumatic memories of the even deeper, greater horrors of the Holocaust, and that Israelis feel profoundly vulnerable. That's all true. But that is not enough of a justification for what Israel has done in Gaza or what it's currently doing in Lebanon.
We often hear the argument that it faces an existential threat from Iran and its proxies. You've challenged that, though. Does Iran pose an existential threat to Israel?
No, I don't believe it does. An existential threat is a threat to the very existence. Literally, it means a threat to your life. And we bandying this word around, and the reason I became worried about it is that I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were always saying, Afghanistan posed an existential threat to global security because of 9/11. Now, 9/11 was not an existential threat to the United States. It was a terrible, tragic, horrible event which devastated thousands of families. But it wasn't an existential threat to the survival of the United States, nor is Iran to Israel. Now, it could be if it had a nuclear weapon, but it doesn't have a nuclear weapon. In fact, what Iran has revealed over the last few weeks is far weaker than anybody believed. Iran and Hezbollah, rather than being this sort of power that somehow is going to be able to rain hundreds of thousands of precision missiles into Israel, even under the face of incredible Israeli attacks and provocation, at the moment where Hezbollah is being attacked, where Iranian guests at the inauguration, like Ismail Haniyeh, are being assassinated, where Iranian diplomats are being killed by the Israelis, where they have every reason to respond, are able to inflict very, very little damage on Israel. And so the argument then from Israel is not that at the moment Iran and Hezbollah are an existential threat, but that they might be so in the future. And then the question is, well, what is Israel's idea here? What are they trying to do? And the extreme right in Netanyahu's government is fantasizing about regime change in Iran. But everything that we've seen in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, shows us that regime change doesn't work. Right? What is this fantasy? The idea is that you somehow drop a few bombs on Iran and suddenly, hooray, Iran's going to turn into Sweden, right? It's crazy. It's much more likely to trigger a civil war or a military government, and a government that's likely to be extremely anti-Israel. So this takes us all the way back to the reason for the Iraq War. I mean, the same people in Israeli politics who are now pushing for an attack on Iran were pushing for the attack against Saddam Hussein, because Saddam Hussein was also an existential threat to Israel. So Saddam Hussein is toppled. $3 trillion was spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those countries are, if anything, more dangerous and more Iranian-dominated than they were before.
History echoing once more. Rory Stewart, we are out of time. It's been wonderful to pick your brains and canvass some big global and local issues. Thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with your time in Australia.
Thank you for having me.
And if you have any thoughts on this conversation, drop us a line, insiders@abc.net.au. We'll see you Sunday morning. We'll be live from Brisbane after the Queensland election. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.